History remembers Porfirio Díaz as both a modernizer and a tyrant, a man who brought Mexico into the industrial age, yet kept his people shackled under authoritarian control. For more than 3 decades, from 1876 to 1911, Díaz presided over what is now called the Porfiriato, a period marked by rapid modernization, economic expansion, foreign investment, and the rise of railroads, cities, and industry. At the same time, his rule was notorious for political repression, the silencing of dissent and the deepening of social and economic inequalities. To understand Díaz is to explore one of history's most complex paradoxes: how a leader could simultaneously deliver stability and prosperity while sowing the very seeds of revolution that would ultimately consume his regime. In order to grasp the significance of Porfirio Díaz's leadership, one must consider the turbulent backdrop against which he rose to power. Mid-19th century Mexico was a nation plagued by instability. Independence from Spain had come in 1821, but the decades that followed were dominated by political chaos, regional rivalries, and foreign interventions. Mexico lost nearly half of its territory to the United States during the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, a humiliating blow that left the country fractured and demoralized. The political landscape was bitterly divided between liberals, who sought a secular modern republic with reduced church and military power, and conservatives, who clung to tradition, hierarchy, and ecclesiastical authority. The Reform War, 1858-1861, pitted these two visions of Mexico against each other in a bloody civil conflict. Even after liberal victory, the country remained unstable, and European powers saw an opportunity. In 1862, France under Emperor Napoleon III invaded Mexico and installed Maximilian of Habsburg as emperor. Yet from this foreign occupation arose a generation of nationalist fighters, among them Porfirio Díaz, a young, ambitious general who helped rally Mexican resistance and push out the French by 1867. Díaz's reputation as a patriot and military hero was born in these struggles, setting the stage for his eventual political rise. When Díaz seized power in 1876, Mexico was a nation desperate for order. Presidents came and went in rapid succession, coups were common, and the economy was stagnant. Foreign nations doubted Mexico's reliability, and investors hesitated to put money into a country where governments fell like dominoes. For the vast majority of Mexicans, particularly the rural poor, daily life was marked by grinding poverty, illiteracy, and a lack of infrastructure. Roads were few, railways fewer still, and communication between regions was primitive. Mexico seemed locked in a cycle of underdevelopment, unable to harness its vast natural resources or integrate its diverse regions into a unified nation. It was into this void of leadership and vision that Porfirio Díaz stepped. His promise was simple yet powerful: order and progress. These two words captured both the yearning of the elites for stability and the dream of modernity that resonated with an emerging middle class. Díaz understood that Mexico could not attract foreign investment or build railroads, mines, and factories without a stable political system, and he was willing to impose that stability by whatever means necessary. Democracy, he believed, was a luxury Mexico could not yet afford. What the country needed, in his view, was firm, centralized control, and he was more than willing to provide it. The Díaz regime is one of history's greatest studies in paradox. On one hand, the Porfiriato brought unprecedented modernization to Mexico. Under Díaz, railroads expanded from a mere handful of miles to tens of thousands, linking remote regions and stimulating commerce. Telegraph lines crisscrossed the nation, cities grew rapidly, and Mexico City itself transformed into a modern metropolis with European-style boulevards, theaters, and cafes. Education expanded, industries grew, and Mexico became a magnet for foreign capital. International observers marveled at how the once chaotic republic had been transformed into a seemingly stable and modern nation. Yet beneath this glittering facade lay harsh realities. The price of modernization was borne disproportionately by Mexico's rural majority. Indigenous communities were dispossessed of their lands, forced into labor on plantations and haciendas, or pressed into debt peonage. Wages remained low, working conditions brutal, and strikes were violently suppressed. Politically, Díaz brooked no dissent. Elections were stage-managed, opposition newspapers shut down, and critics exiled or jailed. Stability came not from democracy, but from an iron grip on power. Thus, the central question historians continue to debate is whether Díaz should be remembered as a visionary modernizer who pulled Mexico into the modern era, or as a dictatorial tyrant who crushed liberty in the name of progress. The truth, as this essay will explore, is far more nuanced. Díaz was both. His policies modernized Mexico's economy and infrastructure, but his authoritarian rule also deepened inequalities and silenced voices of reform. In the end, the contradictions of his rule made revolution inevitable. More than a century after his fall, Porfirio Díaz remains a figure of fascination and controversy in Mexico. Some still praise him as the leader who made Mexico modern, pointing to the railroads, factories, and foreign investments he attracted. Others condemn him as a symbol of repression and inequality, a man who enriched elites while leaving millions of peasants in misery. His legacy is contested not only in Mexico, but also in the broader study of modernization. Can a nation truly progress if progress is imposed through dictatorship? Can stability be justified if it comes at the cost of freedom? The Mexican Revolution, 1910-1920, which began as a direct revolt against Díaz, reshaped the country profoundly and remains one of the most significant social revolutions of the 20th century. But without Díaz's decades of authoritarian modernization, the revolution might never have taken the form it did. To study Díaz is therefore to study not only one man, but also the forces of modernization, authoritarianism, and revolution that have shaped modern Latin America. Here we will explore Porfirio Díaz's life and legacy, beginning with his humble origins and rise as a soldier, moving through his seizure and consolidation of power, and then examining the multifaceted nature of the Porfiriato. We will consider the political system he built, the economic transformations he unleashed, the social costs of his policies, and the intellectual and cultural climate of the era. We will then turn to the growing opposition, the crisis of 1910, his fall, and his years in exile. Finally, we will evaluate his enduring legacy and the ways in which his name continues to spark debate in Mexico and beyond. Through this exploration, the goal is not to judge Díaz as wholly good or wholly bad, but to understand him as a product of his time, a man who embodied both the aspirations and the contradictions of a nation struggling to find its place in the modern world. Porfirio Díaz was born José de la Cruz Porfirio Díaz Mori on September 15, 1830, in the city of Oaxaca, a culturally rich but economically modest region in southern Mexico. His birth came the day before Mexico's Independence Day, a coincidence that would later be woven into the narrative of his life, as though destiny had marked him for greatness. He was the sixth of 7 children born to José Faustino Díaz Orozco and Petrona Mori, a family of mixed heritage. His father, of mestizo background, worked as a modest innkeeper and farmer, while his mother descended from a family with Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Tragedy struck early. Díaz's father died when Porfirio was just 3 years old. This left the family in a precarious financial situation, and it fell largely on his mother to ensure her children's survival and education. Despite hardship, Díaz's early life in Oaxaca provided him with exposure to 2 important influences: the Catholic Church, which shaped much of his early schooling, and the deep indigenous traditions of the region. This duality between European Catholic culture and indigenous Mexican roots would remain an undercurrent in Díaz's identity throughout his life. As a boy, Díaz showed academic promise, and his mother envisioned for him a career in the priesthood, a common aspiration for families seeking security and prestige for their sons. He entered the Seminario Conciliar de Oaxaca, where he studied theology, Latin, and philosophy. For a time, it seemed he would follow a religious path. Yet Díaz was restless, ambitious, and increasingly drawn not to the quiet life of a priest, but to the dynamic and often violent world of politics and military struggle that surrounded him. In the 1840s, Mexico was reeling from foreign invasions, economic difficulties, and constant political upheaval. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, during which Mexico lost half its territory, left a deep impression on Díaz as a teenager. The sight of foreign armies occupying Mexican land awakened in him a fierce nationalism and a determination to defend his country's sovereignty. Around this time, he made the decisive choice to abandon the priesthood and pursue law and eventually a military career. In 1850, Díaz enrolled at the Institute of Science and Arts of Oaxaca, where he studied law under the mentorship of Benito Juárez, who would later become president of Mexico and Díaz's eventual rival. At the institute, Díaz was exposed to the principles of liberalism, ideas that called for constitutional government, secularization, reduction of church and military privileges, and modernization of Mexico's political institutions. These ideas resonated deeply with the young Díaz, whose personal discipline and ambition aligned with the liberal vision of national reform. Díaz's legal studies, however, were soon interrupted by the call of arms. Mexico's political divisions between liberals and conservatives escalated into open conflict, and Díaz chose the path of action. His decision to fight for the liberal cause would shape his future, placing him at the center of the nation's struggles and allowing him to rise through the ranks as a soldier and leader. The Reform War, fought between liberal and conservative factions, erupted in 1857 following the passage of the Liberal Constitution. This constitution sought to enshrine freedoms of speech, press, and religion, while curtailing the privileges of the Catholic Church and the military. Conservatives, defending traditional structures, rejected it, plunging the nation into civil war. Porfirio Díaz enlisted as a liberal soldier, quickly demonstrating courage, decisiveness, and an unflinching commitment to discipline. He fought in several key battles, and his leadership skills soon won him promotion. Known for his personal bravery, Díaz often placed himself at the front lines, earning respect from his men and recognition from his superiors. His military career advanced rapidly. By his late 20s, he had attained the rank of general. The Reform War was brutal and left the nation exhausted, but the liberal victory in 1861 solidified Díaz's reputation as a defender of republican principles. For a brief moment, it seemed Mexico might finally embark on a path of stable governance under Juárez and the liberal leadership. But foreign ambitions soon shattered this fragile peace. In 1862, France, under Emperor Napoleon III, launched an invasion of Mexico, ostensibly to collect debts, but with the grander aim of establishing a European-style monarchy in the Americas. With the support of Mexican conservatives, the French installed Archduke Maximilian of Habsburg as emperor. For many Mexicans, this was an intolerable affront to national sovereignty. Once again, Díaz rose to the call of patriotism. Díaz became one of the most celebrated generals in the war against the French. He commanded troops in Oaxaca and Puebla, employing guerrilla tactics and innovative strategies against a better-equipped foreign army. His most famous victory came in 1867 at the Battle of Puebla, not to be confused with the Cinco de Mayo Battle of 1862, but a later engagement in which Díaz's forces decisively defeated the imperial army. His triumphs enhanced his stature as a national hero, second only to Benito Juárez in prominence among liberal leaders. By 1867, the French were driven out, Maximilian was captured and executed, and the liberal republic was restored under Juárez. For Díaz, these years were transformative. He had proven himself a military genius, a patriot, and a leader of men. His reputation was cemented, and he had gained the confidence and ambition to seek political power for himself. Although Díaz admired Juárez as a mentor and respected his leadership, tensions soon developed between the two men. Juárez, re-elected as president in 1867 and again in 1871, believed in consolidating power to stabilize the fragile republic. Díaz, however, was increasingly critical of what he saw as Juárez's overreach and growing authoritarian tendencies. In 1871, Díaz issued the Plan de la Noria, a political manifesto calling for no re-election and denouncing Juárez's repeated attempts to cling to power. Although the rebellion failed and Juárez remained president, the incident revealed Díaz's political ambitions and his willingness to challenge authority. Ironically, Díaz would later abandon this principle entirely, becoming synonymous with indefinite re-election during his own rule. By the early 1870s, Díaz had positioned himself as a prominent national figure, both a hero of the anti-French struggle and a critic of entrenched leadership. The Mexican people admired his courage and discipline, while elites began to view him as a potential alternative to Juárez and his successor, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada. When Juárez died in 1872, Díaz's political aspirations only intensified. The combination of his indigenous background, his liberal principles, his heroic military record, and his personal charisma made him a formidable figure in Mexican politics. He embodied, in many ways, the contradictions of the nation itself. Deeply rooted in indigenous Mexico, yet striving for European-style progress, committed to liberal ideals, yet drawn to the allure of strong, centralized authority. These tensions would define the rest of his life. In 1876, with the Plan de Tuxtepec, Díaz launched another rebellion, this time successful, that catapulted him into the presidency. But before that turning point, his early life and military career had already etched him into Mexico's collective memory as a man of discipline, nationalism, and relentless ambition. By the early 1870s, Mexico was once again teetering on the edge of political instability. Benito Juárez, Díaz's former mentor, had died in 1872 while still in office. His death left Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, the head of the Supreme Court, as interim president. Lerdo soon secured election to the presidency in his own right, but his administration was plagued by charges of corruption, favoritism, and authoritarianism. For Porfirio Díaz, who had already challenged Juárez with the Plan de la Noria in 1871, Lerdo's presidency represented yet another betrayal of the liberal ideals of democracy and constitutionalism. In his eyes, Lerdo continued the dangerous pattern of indefinite re-election, undermining the revolutionary principle of change in leadership. Although Díaz had failed in his first rebellion, the discontent among various factions, liberals disillusioned with Lerdo, conservatives seeking stability, and military officers hungry for opportunity, created fertile ground for another attempt. In January 1876, Díaz issued the Plan de Tuxtepec, a revolutionary manifesto named after a town in Oaxaca. The central rallying cry was once again, no re-election. This principle became the moral and political justification for Díaz's uprising, appealing to those weary of entrenched leadership. The plan accused Lerdo of corruption, electoral fraud, and betrayal of liberal values, calling for his removal and the restoration of honest governance. But beyond lofty rhetoric, the Plan de Tuxtepec was also a shrewd political calculation. By presenting himself as the defender of republican principles, Díaz gained support, not only from liberals disillusioned with Lerdo, but also from conservatives and regional leaders who sought to check the power of the central government. He promised to respect the Constitution, uphold liberties, and restore order, promises that masked his deeper ambition to consolidate power for himself. The rebellion quickly spread across the country, gathering momentum as military garrisons defected and provincial leaders joined Díaz's cause. By November 1876, his forces decisively defeated Lerdo's army at the Battle of Tecoac. Lerdo fled into exile, and Díaz marched triumphantly into Mexico City. After years of ambition, rebellion, and near failure, Porfirio Díaz was now president of Mexico. Díaz's first term as president was not without complications. Under the rules of the Constitution, he was initially obliged to hand power temporarily to a political ally, Juan Méndez, before formally assuming the presidency in May 1877. This transitional period reflected the tenuous legitimacy of his rise. After all, Díaz had come to power not through an election, but through armed rebellion. Still, once firmly installed, he set about consolidating his position. Díaz faced immediate challenges. Mexico was still fractured by regionalism, plagued by banditry and burdened by debt. His authority, though strong in central Mexico, was not universally recognized, and rival factions remained restless. To secure his regime, Díaz had to blend military strength, political alliances, and pragmatic concessions. Several key strategies allowed Díaz to stabilize his rule in these early years. 1. Centralization of power. Díaz quickly recognized that regional caudillos, warlords, posed the greatest threat to national unity. To counter them, he pursued a policy of co-optation and suppression. Those who joined his side were rewarded with positions, while those who resisted were crushed militarily. 2. Conciliating the military. Having risen through the army himself, Díaz understood its importance. He placed loyal generals in key posts, but also sought to reduce the military's independent power by cutting budgets and gradually professionalizing the institution. This weakened potential rivals while strengthening his personal control. Balancing liberal and conservative interests. Though a lifelong liberal, Díaz knew he needed broad support. He eased tensions with the Catholic Church, which had been stripped of much power during the Reform era, allowing it greater freedom in religious matters. This pragmatic approach won him conservative goodwill without entirely abandoning liberal principles. 4. Symbolism and nationalism. Díaz projected himself as a unifier and patriot. His image as the hero of the anti-French resistance and as the champion of no re-election gave him credibility, even if he would later betray that principle. He cast himself as the embodiment of Mexican resilience, able to restore order after decades of chaos. In his first years in office, Díaz sought to portray himself as a reformer who would heal Mexico's divisions. His administration launched measures to restore financial stability, improve infrastructure, and encourage foreign investment. Railroads were promoted as the key to modernization, and Díaz courted European and US investors with promises of stability and favorable conditions. Yet these early policies were accompanied by a sharp edge of authoritarianism. While Díaz spoke of liberty, he also made clear that dissent would not be tolerated. Newspapers that criticized the regime were harassed, opposition politicians intimidated, and elections manipulated. The seeds of the Porfiriato's political system, formal democratic institutions hollowed out by authoritarian control, were already being planted. The greatest irony of Díaz's rise is that his most powerful slogan, "No re-election," would eventually become the very principle he discarded. After serving his first term, 1877-1880, Díaz stepped aside in favor of a loyal ally, Manuel González, to respect the Constitution. Yet this was less a genuine retreat than a tactical maneuver. During González's presidency, Díaz maintained influence behind the scenes, ensuring that his interests were protected. By 1884, Díaz returned to power, this time securing changes that allowed indefinite re-election. The man who had rebelled against Juárez and Lerdo for clinging to power now entrenched himself in office for the next 3 decades. This contradiction would forever haunt his legacy. The revolutionary who rose against re-election became the dictator who embodied it. From his return in 1884, Díaz began to construct the enduring framework of the Porfiriato. Authoritarian stability. Elections continued to be held, but they were stage-managed, with Díaz always emerging victorious. Local governments were staffed with loyalists, ensuring top-down control. The Científicos. A group of technocratic advisors influenced by positivist philosophy, the Científicos championed order and progress through science, modernization, and foreign investment. They became the intellectual architects of Díaz's policies. Modernization agenda. Díaz prioritized railroads, telegraphs, mining, and industry, believing that economic growth would secure Mexico's place in the modern world. These foundations, laid in the 1870s and early 1880s, would define Mexico for the next 3 decades. What began as a rebellion against re-election transformed into a regime of indefinite re-election. What started as a promise of liberty became an era of censorship and repression. Yet for many Mexicans, particularly elites and foreign investors, the stability Díaz brought was a welcome respite from the chaos of earlier decades. The rise of Porfirio Díaz to power in 1876 represents one of the great turning points in Mexican history. It was the moment when Mexico shifted from decades of instability and frequent leadership changes to a long period of centralized authoritarianism. The Porfiriato would bring modernization and progress, but also repression and inequality. Díaz's genius lay in his ability to balance contradictions, liberal and conservative, modern and traditional, authoritarian and reformist. He was a military man who valued discipline, but also a politician who understood the art of compromise. His rise marked the birth of a political order that would last until the Mexican Revolution of 1910. When Porfirio Díaz returned to the presidency in 1884, he began to formalize what became one of the longest-lasting authoritarian systems in Latin America. The genius of Díaz's political system lay in its appearance of legality. On paper, Mexico remained a constitutional republic with regular elections, a congress, state governors, and a free press. In practice, however, these institutions were hollow shells controlled by Díaz and his inner circle. Díaz understood that outright abolition of democratic forms would provoke resistance both at home and abroad. Instead, he kept the forms of democracy while draining them of substance. Elections were held, but their outcomes were predetermined. Congress convened, but it functioned as a rubber stamp. Newspapers existed, but those that challenged the regime were silenced. This democratic dictatorship allowed Díaz to claim legitimacy while ruling with near absolute power. The cornerstone of Díaz's political control was the manipulation of elections. Presidential elections were carefully staged rituals in which Díaz's candidacy was presented as the only viable option. Ballot boxes were stuffed, voter rolls manipulated, and opponents intimidated or excluded. The outcome was never in doubt. Díaz won every election he contested after 1884, remaining in office until 1911. At the local level, governors and mayors were also elected, but their selection depended on Díaz's approval. He practiced a system of rotating governors, frequently moving officials from one state to another to prevent them from building independent power bases. Loyalty to Díaz, not local popularity or competence, was the true requirement for holding office. Díaz maintained his grip through an elaborate web of patronage. Political allies, military leaders, and wealthy elites were rewarded with lucrative government posts, land concessions, or contracts. In return, they provided loyalty and support. This system of favors created a self-reinforcing network. To oppose Díaz was to risk losing one's livelihood and influence, while to support him promised wealth and advancement. The patronage system extended into the military. While Díaz had risen through the ranks as a general, he sought to weaken the independent power of the army by carefully distributing commands. Generals were kept dependent on the president for promotions and rewards. Units were rotated frequently to prevent regional loyalties from forming. Over time, the military ceased to be an autonomous political actor and became instead an instrument of the regime. One of Díaz's most remarkable achievements was his ability to balance the competing interests of liberals and conservatives, particularly regarding the Catholic Church. The liberal reform laws of the 1850s had stripped the Church of much of its wealth and legal privileges. Conservatives longed to restore its influence, while liberals feared any return to clerical power. Díaz charted a pragmatic middle course. He upheld the legal framework of the reform laws, reassuring liberals that the separation of church and state remained intact. At the same time, he quietly allowed the Church greater freedom to operate in education and charity, and he refrained from enforcing anti-clerical laws too harshly. This strategy appeased conservatives without provoking liberals, turning the once divisive religious question into a manageable issue. A crucial component of Díaz's political system was the rise of the científicos, a group of technocrats and intellectuals influenced by the French philosophy of positivism, particularly the ideas of Auguste Comte. Positivism emphasized science, order, and progress as the guiding principles of society. For the científicos, Mexico's future lay in modernization, industrialization, and rational governance guided by experts. Under Díaz, the científicos became powerful advisors and administrators. Figures like José Yves Limantour, Minister of Finance, played pivotal roles in shaping economic and social policies. They provided the intellectual justification for Díaz's authoritarian rule. Democracy, they argued, was premature in a country as unstable as Mexico. What Mexico needed was firm leadership to impose order, attract foreign capital, and guide the nation toward modernity. This philosophy fit neatly with Díaz's own instincts. The Porfiriato thus presented itself not as tyranny, but as enlightened despotism, a necessary stage of discipline before the eventual flowering of democracy. Progress, they claimed, required the temporary sacrifice of liberty. Díaz recognized the power of the press in shaping public opinion. Newspapers that supported the regime received subsidies, government advertising, and access to official information. Critical voices, however, were censored, harassed, or outright shut down. Journalists who pushed too far faced imprisonment or exile. Yet Díaz was careful not to eliminate all criticism. A small degree of tolerated dissent created the illusion of freedom and allowed him to gauge public opinion. By managing rather than completely suppressing the press, he maintained the facade of republican pluralism while keeping control firmly in his hands. To enforce order across the countryside, Díaz relied on the rurales, a national rural police force. Originally created by Juárez, the rurales were expanded and professionalized under Díaz, becoming a symbol of Porfirian authority. Dressed in distinctive uniforms inspired by charro attire, they projected both discipline and Mexican cultural pride. The rurales were tasked with suppressing banditry, which had long plagued rural Mexico. To some extent, they succeeded. Highways became safer, and commerce flowed more freely. But the rurales also served as enforcers of the regime, crushing peasant uprisings, breaking strikes, and intimidating political opponents. Their reputation for brutality was legendary, and for many rural Mexicans, they became the embodiment of Porfirian repression. Mexico's history had long been marked by the dominance of regional caudillos, local warlords, who commanded loyalty in their provinces. Díaz, himself once a regional strongman from Oaxaca, understood the danger they posed to national unity. His solution was a careful balancing act. Some caudillos were co-opted into the regime with offers of office or wealth, while others were marginalized or eliminated. This strategy gradually reduced the power of regional leaders and centralized authority in Mexico City. For the first time in the nation's history, the presidency wielded truly national control. The price, however, was the erosion of local autonomy and the deepening of resentment among marginalized communities. Behind the facade of stability and progress lay a ruthless system of repression. Political opponents were routinely jailed, exiled, or eliminated. Strikes by workers were met with armed force, as at the Cananea mine strike 1906 and the Rio Blanco textile strike 1907, where soldiers and rurales opened fire on workers. Indigenous uprisings such as the Yaqui resistance in Sonora were crushed with mass deportations and violence. Díaz's regime tolerated no serious opposition. While Mexico appeared orderly on the surface, this order was maintained through fear. The famous saying of the Porfiriato, pan o palo, con bread or the stick, captured the essence of his rule: rewards for loyalty, punishment for dissent. For more than 3 decades, Díaz's political system seemed remarkably stable. To foreign investors and domestic elites, Mexico appeared transformed from a chaotic republic into a disciplined, modernizing nation. Díaz himself cultivated an image of paternal authority, stern, disciplined, incorruptible, and committed to Mexico's progress. But beneath this stability lay deep tensions. The majority of Mexicans remained poor, landless, and excluded from political participation. Indigenous communities were dispossessed, workers oppressed, and peasants trapped in debt peonage. The very system that created order also sowed the seeds of revolution. The political system of the Porfiriato was a masterpiece of authoritarian engineering. Díaz balanced competing interests: liberals and conservatives, church and state, military and civilian, regional and national, while maintaining himself as the indispensable center. He used the rhetoric of democracy while practicing dictatorship, the promise of progress while imposing repression. This system worked for decades, delivering stability and modernization, but it was built on fragile foundations: fear, inequality, and the silencing of dissent. In the next sections, we will explore how Díaz's economic policies, hailed as engines of progress, deepened these contradictions and ultimately led to his downfall. From the outset of his long presidency, Díaz believed that economic modernization was the key to national strength. For him, a modern Mexico meant railroads crisscrossing the land, mines exporting silver and copper to global markets, factories producing textiles and steel, and urban centers that resembled Paris or New York. But Díaz also understood that these ambitions required 2 preconditions: political stability and foreign capital. He delivered the first through authoritarian control and invited the second through generous concessions to investors. The Díaz regime embraced the motto of the French positivists: order and progress. Order, secured through centralized authority and repression, was presented as the necessary foundation for progress. Without order, Díaz argued, Mexico would remain a fractured, unstable republic, unworthy of foreign trust. With order, however, Mexico could attract the capital, technology, and expertise needed to modernize. Nothing symbolized Díaz's vision of modernization more than the railroads. When he first came to power in 1876, Mexico had only about 640 kilometers, 400 miles of rail lines, mostly scattered and disconnected. By the end of his rule in 1911, Mexico boasted more than 19,000 kilometers, 12,000 miles of track. Railroads revolutionized the Mexican landscape. Economic integration. Regions once isolated were now connected to national and global markets. Goods such as henequen from Yucatan, silver from Zacatecas, and coffee from Veracruz could be transported quickly and profitably. Urban growth. Cities like Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Mexico City expanded rapidly, fueled by new commercial networks. Military control. Railroads allowed the regime to move troops quickly, suppressing rebellions and enforcing central authority. Symbol of progress. For elites, the sight of trains cutting across the countryside embodied the promise of modernity. Yet railroads also brought disruption. Indigenous communities lost communal lands as tracks cut through their territories. Small farmers found themselves displaced by commercial agriculture oriented toward export markets. While elites and investors prospered, peasants often suffered from the transformation. Mining had long been central to Mexico's economy, but under Díaz it entered a new era. The government passed favorable mining laws in the 1880s and 1890s that encouraged foreign ownership of mines. Taxes were kept low, legal protections were extended, and land grants were offered to companies willing to invest. American, British, French, and German capital poured into Mexico, reviving old mines and opening new ones. Silver, copper, and zinc productions soared, with Mexico becoming one of the world's leading exporters of silver. The northern states, in particular, became hubs of mining activity, reshaping their economies around foreign-owned enterprises. For investors and the Mexican elite, this was a golden age. But for miners, conditions were brutal. Wages were low, hours long, and safety regulations almost non-existent. Strikes were crushed with violence, as seen in the Cananea strike of 1906, when workers demanding better pay and conditions were met with deadly force. While railroads and mines symbolized industrial progress, the majority of Mexicans still lived in rural communities. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, but under Díaz it shifted increasingly toward large haciendas and export crops. The regime implemented policies that stripped indigenous and peasant communities of their communal lands. The Ley de Deslinde y Colonización, law of demarcation and colonization, allowed survey companies, often owned by Díaz's allies, to seize unused land and sell it to private owners. In practice, vast tracts of indigenous land were declared vacant, surveyed, and transferred to hacendados, large landowners, or foreign companies. The result was the concentration of land into fewer hands. By 1910, less than 1% of the population owned more than 85% of arable land, while millions of peasants were reduced to landless laborers. They worked on haciendas for meager wages, often trapped in debt peonage, a system where workers were paid in company scrip redeemable only at the hacienda store, making escape nearly impossible. Export crops such as henequen, used for rope, coffee and sugarcane dominated hacienda production, enriching elites while leaving local communities food insecure. For rural Mexicans, modernization meant dispossession, exploitation, and deepening poverty. Urban centers saw significant industrial growth under Díaz. Factories producing textiles, steel, beer, and cigarettes sprang up, particularly in cities like Monterrey and Puebla. Electricity, streetcars, and telegraphs transformed urban life. Mexico City, in particular, was remade into a modern capital, with European-style boulevards, theaters, and public works projects. But industrial growth was accompanied by harsh labor conditions. Workers toiled long hours for low pay, with little protection from accidents or illness. The gulf between elite lifestyles and working-class poverty grew ever wider. Urban workers, like their rural counterparts, increasingly saw modernization not as a blessing, but as a burden imposed upon them. One of the defining features of Díaz's economic modernization was its reliance on foreign investment. By 1910, foreign investors, primarily from the United States, Britain, and France, controlled most of Mexico's railroads, mines, banks, and factories. Díaz welcomed this dependence, believing that foreign capital was essential for modernization. He reassured investors with stability, favorable laws, and personal guarantees of protection. To many elites, this policy seemed pragmatic. Mexico lacked the domestic capital and technology to modernize on its own. However, foreign dominance of the economy came at a cost. National sovereignty was compromised as Mexico's wealth flowed abroad. Economic decisions were increasingly dictated by foreign interests, while ordinary Mexicans bore the consequences of low wages, high rents, and limited opportunities. Resentment simmered, especially among nationalists who saw the regime as selling Mexico's patrimony to outsiders. It must be acknowledged that Díaz's modernization policies created wealth and opportunities for certain groups. The Mexican elite, particularly landowners, industrialists, and urban professionals, flourished under the Porfiriato. They benefited from land seizures, foreign partnerships, and new industries. For them, the Porfiriato was a golden age of economic expansion, cosmopolitan culture, and unprecedented prosperity. Foreign residents also enjoyed privileges. Americans, British, and French investors lived in enclaves with modern amenities, often enjoying better standards of living in Mexico than in their home countries. The Porfiriato was a time of banquets, balls, and conspicuous consumption for those at the top. For the majority of Mexicans, however, the costs of modernization outweighed the benefits. Peasants lost land and autonomy. Workers endured exploitation and repression. Indigenous communities faced dispossession and marginalization. The promise of progress seemed hollow when accompanied by deepening inequality and poverty. By 1910, Mexico had become a country of stark contrasts. Glittering modern cities alongside impoverished villages, foreign-owned mines and railroads alongside dispossessed peasants, elite prosperity alongside mass suffering. These contradictions created the conditions for social unrest and revolutionary change. The economic modernization of the Porfiriato was both transformative and destructive. On the one hand, Díaz succeeded in integrating Mexico into the global economy, building infrastructure, and laying the foundations for industrial growth. On the other hand, his reliance on foreign capital, land concentration, and suppression of labor left deep scars on Mexican society. Historians continue to debate whether Díaz's policies were a necessary stage of development or a betrayal of the Mexican people. What is clear is that his model of modernization without social justice created tensions too great to sustain. These tensions would explode in 1910, when the very people he had marginalized rose up in revolution. The economic policies of Porfirio Díaz reshaped not only Mexico's infrastructure and economy, but also its social fabric and cultural life. Modernization brought glittering cities, European-style boulevards, and industrial factories, but it also created stark contrasts between wealth and poverty, urban and rural, indigenous and mestizo, tradition and modernity. The Porfiriato was an age of contradiction. While elites embraced European fashions and Parisian lifestyles, millions of rural peasants and indigenous people faced dispossession and despair. The social and cultural consequences of Díaz's rule reveal how modernization can simultaneously uplift and oppress, integrate and exclude. Few groups bore the brunt of Díaz's policies more harshly than indigenous peoples. For centuries, many indigenous communities had maintained communal landholding systems that allowed collective use of farmland, forests, and resources. These communal lands were not only economic lifelines, but also the basis of cultural and spiritual life. Díaz's government, however, pursued policies that dismantled communal ownership in favor of privatization. The Ley de Delinda y Colonización, as discussed earlier, declared vast areas of communal land unused or vacant, transferring them to private survey companies and hacendados. In reality, These lands were anything but unused. They sustained indigenous communities for generations. The result was widespread dispossession. By 1910, millions of indigenous people had lost their ancestral lands, forced instead to work as laborers on haciendas, plantations, or in mines. Entire communities like the Yaqui in Sonora faced brutal campaigns of forced relocation and enslavement. Thousands of Yaquis were deported to the Yucatan Peninsula to work in henequen plantations under horrific conditions, their families torn apart. Modernization for indigenous Mexicans meant the destruction of traditional ways of life, cultural marginalization, and subjugation. For the majority of Mexicans who lived in rural areas, the Porfiriato was an era of worsening inequality. The expansion of haciendas concentrated land into fewer hands, while peasants were reduced to landless laborers tied to estates by debt peonage. Rural wages were pitifully low, often paid in tokens redeemable only at company stores. Living conditions were harsh, with limited access to education, healthcare, or justice. Violence and coercion were common tools to enforce labor discipline. The rurales, rural police, patrolled the countryside, suppressing uprisings and punishing those who resisted hacendado control. The romanticized image of peace and order in rural Mexico was maintained only through constant repression. Still, rural communities developed forms of quiet resistance through migration, hidden traditions, and occasional uprisings. The deep resentments that accumulated in the countryside during the Porfiriato would later fuel the revolutionary armies of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. While rural Mexicans faced dispossession, cities expanded rapidly, creating a new urban working class. Factories, mines, and railroads drew migrants from the countryside into cities like Mexico City, Monterrey, Puebla, and Guadalajara. Urban workers faced their own challenges. Long hours and low wages. Industrial workers typically labored 12-14 hours a day for meager pay. Child and female labor. Families often sent children and women to work in factories to supplement income, exposing them to dangerous and exhausting conditions. Poor housing. Migrant workers crowded into tenements with unsanitary conditions, contributing to disease and high mortality rates. Yet cities also became centers of new forms of culture, labor organization, and political thought. Newspapers, cafes, and theaters provided spaces for the exchange of ideas. Workers began to organize unions despite repression, and strikes like those at Cananea 1906 and Rio Blanco 1907 reflected growing class consciousness. The urban working class, though small compared to the rural population, became a key force in challenging Porfirian order. Díaz's modernization also gave rise to a modest but significant middle class composed of merchants, teachers, bureaucrats, lawyers, and small business owners. This group benefited from expanded education and new opportunities in government and commerce. Many in the middle class admired Díaz for bringing stability and progress, but they also yearned for greater political participation. Intellectuals, journalists, and reformers within this group began to criticize the regime's authoritarianism and foreign dependence. Figures like Francisco Franco, Madero, who emerged from a wealthy landowning family but embraced democratic reform, reflected the aspirations of a new middle-class opposition. Perhaps the most striking cultural feature of the Porfiriato was the Europeanization of Mexico's elite. Wealthy Mexicans, inspired by French culture in particular, sought to remake Mexico in Europe's image. Fashion and lifestyle. Aristocrats dressed in Parisian styles, spoke French in salons, and traveled regularly to Europe. Architecture. Mexico City was transformed with French-inspired boulevards, theaters, and public buildings. The Palacio de Bellas Artes and the Monumento a la Independencia, El Ángel, reflected this era's grandeur. Education and science. The científicos promoted positivist philosophy, favoring rationalism, secular education, and scientific progress modeled on Europe. This cultural orientation created a sense of cosmopolitan sophistication among elites, but deepened the gulf between them and the masses. To peasants and workers, the elite appeared alien and disconnected, more European than Mexican. One of Díaz's stated priorities was expanding education as a tool of modernization. Under his regime, the number of schools increased significantly and literacy rates improved. The government emphasized secular scientific education influenced by positivist ideals. However, progress was uneven. Urban areas saw far greater investment in schools than rural communities. Indigenous children were often excluded, and when educated, were taught to abandon their traditions in favor of assimilation into modern Mexican identity. Education became both a tool of progress and an instrument of cultural erasure. Still, the rise in literacy created new opportunities for political awareness. Newspapers and pamphlets reached wider audiences, and education planted seeds for future reform movements. The Porfiriato also saw important developments in art and literature. On one hand, elites embraced European artistic styles, importing opera, classical music, and French art. On the other hand, a growing interest in Mexican identity began to emerge. Intellectuals and artists explored indigenous heritage, folklore, and the uniqueness of Mexican culture, laying the groundwork for the cultural nationalism that flourished after the revolution. Writers such as Manuel Gutiérrez Nájera contributed to modernismo in literature, while visual artists began to experiment with themes that would later influence the Mexican muralist movement of Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. Thus, even within the Porfiriato's elite cultural sphere, contradictions existed. Admiration for European models coexisted with a search for authentic Mexican identity. Women's lives during the Porfiriato were shaped by both continuity and change. For elite women, modernization meant access to European fashions, social events, and limited roles in philanthropy and education. Middle-class women increasingly entered teaching and clerical work, expanding their visibility in public life. However, working-class and rural women bore the brunt of economic exploitation. They labored in factories as domestic servants or in agriculture, often for even lower wages than men. Indigenous women in particular faced multiple layers of oppression, dispossession, poverty, and cultural marginalization. Still, seeds of change were planted. Women's clubs, journalists, and educators began to articulate demands for greater rights, foreshadowing the feminist movements of the 20th century. One of the cultural narratives of the Porfiriato was that Díaz had brought peace to Mexico after decades of turmoil. Elites celebrated the stability that allowed commerce, investment, and leisure to flourish. Yet this peace was largely illusory. It was maintained through repression, censorship, and fear. For peasants forced from their lands, workers shot during strikes, or indigenous communities deported and enslaved, Porfirian peace was experienced as violence and coercion. The myth of order and progress masked a reality of exclusion and inequality. The social and cultural effects of Díaz's modernization reveal a Mexico profoundly divided. Elites enjoyed European luxuries and modern amenities, while the majority endured dispossession, poverty, and repression. Cities became symbols of progress, but rural communities sank deeper into despair. Education spread literacy, but also attempted to erase indigenous traditions. Culturally, the Porfiriato oscillated between imitation of Europe and the beginnings of a search for Mexican identity. Socially, it deepened inequalities that would explode in the Revolution of 1910. Díaz's promise of modernization had indeed transformed Mexico, but at the cost of tearing its social fabric apart. The late 19th century was an era of imperialism, industrial capitalism, and expanding global markets. European powers competed for influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, while the United States, fresh from its Civil War and westward expansion, emerged as a rising industrial and political giant. For a country like Mexico, strategically located and rich in natural resources, the stakes were high. Would Mexico be dominated by foreign powers, or could it leverage international ties to fuel its modernization? Porfirio Díaz sought a careful balance. He knew Mexico lacked the domestic capital and technology to modernize on its own, so he aggressively courted foreign investment. At the same time, he understood the dangers of becoming overly dependent on any single power, particularly the United States. His foreign policy was thus a blend of pragmatism, opportunism, and occasional defiance. No foreign relationship mattered more to Díaz than that with the United States, Mexico's powerful northern neighbor. History made this relationship complicated. Less than 30 years before Díaz took power, Mexico had lost half its territory to the US in the Mexican-American War. Memories of this humiliation lingered, and anti-American sentiment was strong among Mexicans. Yet Díaz recognized that the US was both a threat and an opportunity. Its booming economy made it the most important market for Mexican goods and the primary source of foreign capital. American investors poured money into Mexico's railroads, mines, and oil industry, often gaining significant influence over local economies. By 1910, Americans controlled large portions of northern Mexico's economy. To reassure the US, Díaz presented himself as a stabilizer who could protect American interests. He built close ties with US business leaders and diplomats, assuring them that their investments would be safe under his regime. American companies like Phelps Dodge and Green Consolidated Copper dominated mining, while railroads linked northern Mexico directly to US networks. But Díaz also worked to avoid complete dependence. He sometimes played European powers against the US, seeking French, British, or German investments to balance American influence. He also asserted Mexican sovereignty when pushed too far, most famously in the 1909 meeting with President William Howard Taft in El Paso and Ciudad Juárez, the first meeting between a Mexican and American president. Though largely symbolic, the meeting underscored Mexico's importance in hemispheric politics. Still, resentment brewed within Mexico. Many nationalists accused Díaz of selling out the country to American interests, allowing foreigners to profit while Mexicans suffered. This tension would later fuel revolutionary rhetoric. Díaz had a special affinity for Europe, particularly France. Culturally, he admired European sophistication and sought to model Mexico City on Paris. Politically and economically, he cultivated ties with Britain, France, and Germany to diversify foreign investment and reduce dependence on the US. Britain. The British were heavily involved in Mexican mining, railroads, and banking. London bankers provided loans to stabilize Mexico's finances, and British firms controlled key sectors of the economy. Britain also offered prestige, as alignment with the world's most powerful empire lent legitimacy to Díaz's modernization project. France. Despite the trauma of the French intervention, 1862 to 1867, Díaz restored relations with France, embracing its culture and attracting French investors in textiles, railroads, and luxury goods. French influence dominated Mexico's art, architecture, and fashion during the Porfiriato. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, also invested in Mexican infrastructure and trade. German engineers, scientists, and merchants became part of Mexico's modernization story. Through these European ties, Díaz projected Mexico as a modern civilized nation, integrated into the global economy. At the same time, these relationships reinforced elite Europeanization and widened the gap between cosmopolitan elites and marginalized Mexicans. A hallmark of Díaz's foreign relations was his strategy of balancing foreign powers. By inviting investment from multiple countries, he prevented any single nation, especially the US, from dominating Mexico completely. This balance of foreigners gave Díaz leverage in negotiations and allowed him to maintain a degree of sovereignty despite economic dependence. For example, when American investors pushed too aggressively for concessions, Díaz could turn to British or French firms as counterweights. This strategy reflected his shrewd political instincts. He knew Mexico's weakness on the global stage, but used diplomacy to maximize autonomy. Though Mexico's foreign policy focused on the US and Europe, Díaz also sought to strengthen ties with Latin America. He presented Mexico as a leader in the region, hosting international conferences and promoting Pan-Americanism. However, Díaz was cautious about US-led Pan-American initiatives, fearing they would cement American dominance in the hemisphere. Instead, he promoted bilateral relations with countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, aiming to position Mexico as a bridge between Latin America and Europe. Díaz understood the importance of image and reputation. He carefully cultivated Mexico's international image as a stable, modernizing nation led by a strong but enlightened ruler. Foreign journalists and travelers were encouraged to marvel at Mexico's railroads, industries, and grand boulevards. Official celebrations, such as the centennial of Mexican independence in 1910, were staged as showcases of progress, featuring dazzling parades, cultural exhibitions, and visits from foreign dignitaries. Internationally, Díaz was often praised as a statesman who had transformed a once chaotic republic into a stable, modern power. Foreign governments admired his ability to maintain order and protect investments, even if they turned a blind eye to his authoritarianism. Despite these successes, the contradiction at the heart of Díaz's foreign relations was clear. Modernization came at the cost of economic dependence. By 1910, foreign investors owned much of Mexico's railroads, mines, oil, and banking. Sovereignty was compromised, and resentment grew among Mexicans who saw their country's wealth flowing abroad. This tension between sovereignty and dependence became one of the rallying cries of the Mexican Revolution. Revolutionaries accused Díaz of betraying Mexico to foreigners, enriching elites while leaving the masses impoverished. Another dimension of foreign relations was the US-Mexico border. The late 19th century saw increased cross-border migration, trade, and conflict. Banditry and revolutionary activity often spilled across the border, creating tensions between the two countries. Díaz worked to secure the border, suppress cross-border raids, and cooperate with US officials when necessary. Yet he also faced the dilemma of exiled dissidents who used the US as a base to organize opposition movements. Figures like Ricardo Flores Magón, a radical journalist and revolutionary, published from the US exposing the limits of Díaz's control beyond Mexico's borders. One of the most symbolic moments in Porfirio Díaz's foreign relations was his meeting with US President William Howard Taft in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juárez in October 1909. This was the first-ever meeting between a Mexican and American president. The summit was meant to showcase friendship and cooperation, but it also revealed underlying tensions. Both leaders sought to reassure each other of stability, yet the event was nearly marred by an assassination plot against Díaz. Security was so tight that troops patrolled the streets, highlighting the fragility of Porfirian peace. The meeting demonstrated Díaz's international stature, but also foreshadowed the unrest that would soon end his regime. Porfirio Díaz's foreign relations were characterized by pragmatism, opportunism, and a keen sense of Mexico's geopolitical position. He welcomed foreign capital to fuel modernization while balancing powers to avoid domination by any single nation. He cultivated Mexico's international image as a modern, stable state, earning praise abroad, even as resentment grew at home. Yet the very success of this strategy carried its downfall. By tethering Mexico's economy to foreign capital, Díaz deepened inequalities and provoked nationalist backlash. His diplomacy brought prestige, but it could not shield him from the revolutionary storm brewing within. For decades, Porfirio Díaz had appeared unshakable. His regime projected the image of pan o palo, bread for the loyal, the stick for dissenters. Railroads, modern cities, and foreign investment seemed to prove that Mexico had finally achieved stability after a century of chaos. International visitors marveled at Mexico's progress, and elites basked in luxury. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. By the early 20th century, the very foundations of the Porfiriato were beginning to crumble. The promises of modernization had bypassed the majority, leaving peasants dispossessed, workers exploited, and indigenous peoples brutalized. A new middle class, better educated and more politically aware, grew restless under the regime's authoritarianism. Even within the elite, divisions emerged between those who profited from Díaz's system and those who feared its long-term consequences. The myth of eternal stability began to unravel. The dispossession of peasant and indigenous lands was perhaps the most explosive issue. By 1910, less than 1% of the population owned the vast majority of arable land, while millions of Mexicans toiled as landless laborers on haciendas. The Ley de Linda had stripped indigenous communities of their communal property, and debt peonage trapped families in cycles of poverty. Peasant uprisings flared periodically, particularly in regions like Morelos, where sugar haciendas displaced villages. Though brutally suppressed by the rurales and military, these rebellions revealed deep-seated anger. The cry of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, would later become the rallying call of Emiliano Zapata, whose revolutionary army emerged directly from these grievances. Indigenous communities across Mexico resisted Porfirian policies. The most notable were the Yaqui of Sonora, who waged intermittent wars against the regime throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Díaz responded with ferocity. Thousands of Yaquis were killed, and survivors were deported to distant regions, particularly to Yucatan's henequen plantations. Families were separated, villages destroyed, and cultural survival threatened. This brutal campaign highlighted the ruthlessness of the regime and its willingness to sacrifice entire communities for progress. The treatment of the Yaqui became a symbol of the Porfiriato's disregard for indigenous rights, further fueling revolutionary anger. The industrial growth of the Porfiriato created a new working class, concentrated in mines, factories, and railroads. Conditions were harsh: long hours, low wages, child labor, and unsafe environments. Workers began organizing, inspired by global labor movements and anarchist ideas circulating through the press. Two strikes in particular exposed the regime's vulnerability. The Cananea Strike, 1906. In the copper mines of Sonora, Mexican workers demanded equal pay with their American counterparts, shorter hours, and better conditions. The strike escalated into violence, with U.S. forces even crossing the border to assist in suppressing it. The regime's violent response shocked the nation. The Rio Blanco Strike, 1907. Textile workers in Veracruz went on strike over wage cuts and poor conditions. Díaz sent in the military, which fired on crowds of unarmed workers and their families, leaving hundreds dead. These events shattered the illusion of Porfirian peace. Workers realized that the state would side with capital against labor, no matter the cost. Sympathy for the strikers spread, and repression deepened resentment against the regime. The growth of education during the Porfiriato created a small but influential middle class of teachers, lawyers, journalists, and professionals. Many of them admired modernization, but chafed under political repression. They wanted not only material progress, but also political participation, democracy, and civil liberties. Intellectuals and journalists began criticizing the regime in publications that managed to escape censorship. Figures like Ricardo Flores Magón and the Regeneración newspaper championed radical critiques of Díaz, blending anarchist, socialist, and nationalist ideas. Though exiled to the United States, the Flores Magón brothers influenced a generation of revolutionaries. Meanwhile, reform-minded elites like Francisco Ferrer Madero emerged as voices for democratic change. Madero, a wealthy landowner from Coahuila, shocked the elite by advocating free elections and political reform, planting the seeds of organized opposition to Díaz's indefinite re-election. Even among the elite, cracks appeared. By the early 20th century, Díaz was in his 70s, and the question of succession loomed large. For decades, he had maintained power by balancing rival factions, but now uncertainty grew. Who would succeed him, and what would happen when he was gone? In an interview with American journalist James Creelman in 1908, Díaz made a fateful statement. He declared that Mexico was ready for democracy and that he would not run for re-election in 1910. This remark stunned the nation, as it seemed to open the door to genuine political competition. Opposition movements quickly mobilized, believing that at last the Porfiriato was nearing its end. But Díaz had miscalculated. Perhaps testing the waters, or seeking to burnish his international image, he had unintentionally unleashed forces he could not fully control. Francisco Ferrer Madero seized the opportunity created by Díaz's words. In 1909, he published La Sucesión Presidencial in 1910, a book calling for free elections, democratic reform, and opposition to Díaz's re-election. His message resonated with middle-class reformers, workers, and even disillusioned elites. Madero launched his campaign for the presidency, energizing the opposition with rallies and speeches. For the first time in decades, there was genuine excitement about electoral politics. Díaz, however, soon panicked. Despite his earlier statement, he decided to run for re-election once again in 1910. Madero was arrested and jailed during the campaign, ensuring Díaz's victory in another fraudulent election. But the damage was done. Madero's candidacy had inspired hope, and his imprisonment turned him into a symbol of resistance. Opposition movements rallied around him, convinced that Díaz's regime could no longer be reformed. It had to be overthrown. Ironically, the climax of Díaz's prestige coincided with the beginning of his downfall. In September 1910, Mexico celebrated the centennial of independence with grand parades, lavish banquets, and international visitors. Díaz presided over the festivities as the image of Mexico's progress and stability. Yet outside the glittering celebrations, discontent boiled. Peasants, workers, and radicals whispered of revolt. Less than 2 months later, Madero escaped prison, issued the Plan de San Luis Potosí, and called for Mexicans to rise up against Díaz on November 20th, 1910. The revolution had begun. By the early 20th century, the contradictions of the Porfiriato were impossible to ignore. Land concentration alienated peasants, repression radicalized workers, and censorship failed to silence intellectuals. Even elites grew uneasy as the question of succession loomed. Díaz's promise of order and progress had delivered modernization, but at the cost of liberty, equality, and justice. The seeds of revolution were sown in every corner of society. In the dispossessed villages of Morelos, the mines of Cananea, the factories of Veracruz, and the speeches of Madero. The Porfirian system, once seemingly indestructible, was now a brittle shell. When cracks finally split open in 1910, they would unleash one of the most transformative revolutions of the 20th century. For decades, Porfirio Díaz had seemed untouchable. He had survived rebellions, outmaneuvered rivals, and held Mexico together through authoritarian control. To many elites and foreign observers, his regime looked permanent, the embodiment of order and progress. Yet by 1910, Díaz was over 80 years old. His iron grip remained firm, but the social and political tensions beneath the surface were about to erupt. The Creelman interview of 1908, in which Díaz suggested he would step down and allow free elections, raised expectations that change was finally possible. When he reneged on this hint and ran again in 1910, the illusion of permanence shattered. The stage was set for confrontation. Francisco Ferrer Madero, a wealthy landowner turned reformer, emerged as the unlikely leader of the opposition. His book La Sucesión Presidencial in 1910 had outlined a vision of democratic reform, striking a chord with the middle class and disillusioned elites. His presidential campaign galvanized support across Mexico, attracting peasants, workers, and intellectuals alike. Díaz, however, refused to yield. He had Madero arrested during the campaign, ensuring another fraudulent victory. Official results declared Díaz the winner with near unanimous support, but instead of quelling dissent, this blatant fraud inflamed it. Madero escaped prison and fled to San Antonio, Texas, where he issued the Plan de San Luis Potosí in October 1910. The plan denounced Díaz's regime as illegitimate, called for armed rebellion on November 20th, 1910, and promised to restore democracy. It also pledged to return stolen lands to peasants, a promise that resonated deeply in the countryside. Though initially hesitant, rebels across the country began to mobilize. The revolution began in fits and starts. On November 20th, only small uprisings broke out, and many believed Madero's call had failed. But in the following months, rebellion spread. In Chihuahua, Francisco Pancho Villa and Pascual Orozco rallied forces of peasants, cowboys, and miners. In Morelos, Emiliano Zapata led villagers in demanding the restoration of their lands, shaping the famous cry of Tierra y Libertad. Across the north and south, scattered uprisings began to converge into a national movement. Díaz underestimated the scale of the revolt. At first, he dismissed it as another minor rebellion, confident that his army and the rurales could suppress it as they had countless others. But unlike earlier revolts, this one drew strength from multiple regions and classes. The Mexican army, though large, was stretched thin and plagued by inefficiency. Many soldiers were conscripts with little loyalty, while officers were increasingly disillusioned. Díaz had deliberately weakened the army over the years to prevent rival generals from threatening his power, but this now backfired. Rebel victories mounted. In March 1911, Pascual Orozco and Pancho Villa captured Ciudad Juárez, a critical border city. The fall of Juárez was a turning point. It demonstrated that the Díaz regime could be defeated and gave rebels a strategic stronghold near the U.S. border. The defeat also undermined the confidence of elites and foreign investors. For decades, Díaz had guaranteed stability. Now, with rebellion spreading, stability seemed impossible. Díaz's power had always rested on a coalition of elites, foreign investors and loyal bureaucrats. But as the revolution grew, these supporters began to waver. Elites, wealthy landowners and businessmen, once Díaz's staunch allies, feared that continued fighting would destroy their profits and threaten their privileges. Some began quietly shifting their support to Madero, believing he could restore order without radical social change. Foreigners, the United States, Britain, and other powers valued Díaz's stability, but were pragmatic. When it became clear he could no longer guarantee peace, they prepared to work with new leadership. American officials, in particular, opened channels to Madero, signaling their readiness to accept regime change. Without the unwavering support of elites and foreigners, Díaz's regime lost its foundation. By spring 1911, the situation was untenable. Rebel armies advanced, the military faltered, and public discontent soared. Díaz, once so confident, now recognized the inevitability of defeat. Negotiations began in Ciudad Juárez between representatives of Díaz and Madero. The resulting treaties of Ciudad Juárez, signed in May 1911, called for Díaz's resignation, the appointment of an interim president, and free elections. Madero agreed to leave Díaz's existing institutions largely intact, reassuring elites that revolution would not immediately destroy the system. On May 25, 1911, Porfirio Díaz officially resigned the presidency. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I retire with the satisfaction of having always endeavored to serve my country honestly and loyally, and I now sincerely wish that peace and prosperity may be preserved." After more than 3 decades in power, the Porfirian era had ended. Shortly after resigning, Díaz left Mexico with his family aboard the German ship Ipiranga, departing from Veracruz on May 31, 1911. Crowds gathered at the port, not to cheer but to watch the departure of the man who had dominated their lives for generations. As the ship sailed, Díaz reportedly remarked, "Madero has unleashed a tiger. Let us see if he can control it." The metaphor proved prophetic, as the revolution quickly spiraled into a complex, bloody conflict that reshaped Mexico for the next decade. Díaz traveled to Europe, eventually settling in Paris. For the first time in decades, Mexico existed without him at its helm. The fall of Díaz was both sudden and inevitable. For years his regime had appeared stable, but it was a stability built on repression, inequality, and exclusion. Once rebellion spread, the weaknesses became clear. A hollowed-out army, an alienated populace, and elites willing to abandon him when stability was no longer assured. The revolution was not merely the result of Madero's leadership or Díaz's age. It was the culmination of decades of grievances, land dispossession, worker exploitation, political exclusion, and cultural marginalization. Díaz had held these forces in check through fear and repression, but once released, they overwhelmed his carefully constructed system. On May 25, 1911, the Porfiriato ended. For more than 30 years, Díaz had embodied Mexico's authoritarian modernization. His resignation marked the collapse of an era and the beginning of one of the most significant social revolutions of the 20th century. The fall of Díaz was not simply the removal of a dictator. It was the unraveling of a political and economic order. His departure opened the floodgates of revolution, unleashing forces that neither Madero nor any other leader could fully control. Díaz left Mexico in defeat, but his shadow lingered. His legacy of modernization and repression, progress and inequality would continue to shape Mexico long after his exile. On May 31, 1911, Porfirio Díaz boarded the German steamer Ipiranga in the port of Veracruz. Just days earlier, he had resigned the presidency he had held for more than 3 decades. The man who once seemed synonymous with Mexican stability now departed quietly, accompanied by his family and a small entourage. As the ship sailed eastward across the Atlantic, Diaz gazed for the last time upon the country he had dominated for most of his adult life. The mood among those present was somber. Crowds lined the port, not in celebration but in curiosity and even bitterness. For many Mexicans, Diaz's departure symbolized the end of an oppressive era. For others, it marked the loss of a leader who had brought modernization and order. For Diaz himself, it was a reluctant retreat, made necessary by the collapse of his once unshakable regime. The Ipiranga docked in France in June 1911, and Diaz chose Paris as his place of exile. Paris, the city he had long admired and sought to emulate in Mexico City, offered both familiarity and anonymity. The French capital was at that time a hub of art, culture, and politics, and Diaz settled into its rhythms with relative ease. In Paris, Diaz lived comfortably but modestly compared to the grandeur of his presidential days. He rented apartments near the Champs-Élysées and frequented cafes, libraries, and churches. His health, already fragile, became a central concern. At 81 years old, he suffered from chronic illnesses, including arteriosclerosis and weakened eyesight. Yet he remained intellectually active, reading newspapers and correspondence to follow events in Mexico closely. Diaz spent his years in Paris reflecting on his long rule. Friends and visitors described him as dignified but melancholic, a man aware of his achievements, yet haunted by the violent unrest that followed his departure. In conversations, he defended his legacy. He argued that he had rescued Mexico from chaos, pointing to the railroads, telegraphs, modern cities, and financial stability achieved during the Porfiriato. He acknowledged, however, that mistakes were made, particularly in failing to provide political space for opposition and in underestimating the demands of a changing society. He expressed regret that his final years in power were marked by violence and rebellion, though he believed no other leader could have managed Mexico's competing forces as effectively. Perhaps his most famous reflection was his remark aboard the Ipiranga: "Madero has unleashed a tiger. Let us see if he can control it." This statement revealed both his bitterness and his keen awareness that the revolution would spiral beyond Madero's intentions. Despite his exile, the question of Diaz's return to Mexico lingered. Some of his supporters hoped he might be allowed to come back as a private citizen, while others feared his presence would destabilize the fragile revolutionary government. Diaz himself longed to return, if only to die on Mexican soil. He repeatedly expressed his desire to be buried in Oaxaca, near his family and the land of his birth. Yet political circumstances made this impossible. Madero's government, and later revolutionary leaders, considered his return too risky. To many revolutionaries, Diaz remained the symbol of tyranny and repression. Allowing him back could reignite conflict. As the revolution intensified after 1911, with Madero's assassination in 1913, the rise of Villa and Zapata, and years of civil war, the prospect of Diaz's return faded. He was condemned to spend his final days in exile. In Paris, Diaz lived quietly but continued to receive visitors. Diplomats, journalists, and exiled Mexicans came to see the former president, seeking his opinions on current events. He maintained correspondence with family, allies, and even some critics. Though no longer in power, Diaz remained a figure of fascination in Europe. Newspapers occasionally reported on his activities, and he attended cultural events when his health allowed. Yet his circle grew smaller, as illness confined him more to his home. His wife, Carmen Romero Rubio, and his children provided companionship and care. Religion also offered solace. Diaz, though never overtly pious during his presidency, found comfort in Catholic rituals in his final years. He attended Mass in Parisian churches and prayed for Mexico's future, even as he watched from afar as it descended deeper into revolutionary turmoil. By 1914, Diaz's health had deteriorated significantly. He was frail, often bedridden, and plagued by pain. Still, he clung to the hope of returning to Mexico. Visitors recalled his repeated wish, "If only I could die in my country." But the revolution, now in full fury, made this impossible. On July 2, 1915, Porfirio Díaz died in Paris at the age of 84. His death marked the end of one of Mexico's most consequential lives, a man who had shaped a nation for nearly half a century, yet died far from home. His funeral was held at the Church of Saint-Honoré de Lo, attended by family, diplomats, and members of the Mexican expatriate community. He was buried in Montparnasse Cemetery, where his remains still rest today. Periodically, there have been calls to repatriate his body to Mexico, but political sensitivities and his contested legacy have prevented it. Díaz's exile and death added another layer of complexity to his legacy. To some, his lonely passing in a foreign land symbolized the ultimate judgment on his authoritarian rule. A man who claimed to embody Mexico, yet who died away from it, denied the homeland he once commanded. To others, his death in Paris reflected the tragedy of a misunderstood leader who had given his life to modernization, but was abandoned by the very nation he sought to elevate. Supporters pointed to the chaos of the revolution as proof that Díaz had been right, that only a strong hand could hold Mexico together. The debate over Díaz's exile continues to this day. His tomb in Montparnasse has become a site of both homage and controversy, with Mexican visitors leaving flowers, notes, or even graffiti reflecting the divided memory of his rule. Porfirio Díaz's final years in Paris were marked by dignity, reflection, and unfulfilled longing. He left Mexico under pressure, convinced that his departure would prevent greater bloodshed. Yet his prediction of chaos proved true as the revolution engulfed the nation. His death in exile symbolized the contradictions of his life. A leader who modernized Mexico but alienated its people, a patriot who died far from his homeland, a man remembered both as a tyrant and as a statesman. Though his body rests in Paris, his presence lingers in Mexico's history and memory. The story of Díaz in exile reminds us that even the most powerful rulers cannot escape the judgment of history or the longing for home. When Porfirio Díaz departed in 1911, the revolution quickly recast his image. For Madero and other revolutionaries, Díaz became the symbol of everything the revolution opposed: tyranny, inequality, foreign domination, and repression. The revolution defined itself in opposition to the Porfiriato. Revolutionary propaganda painted Díaz as a dictator who had enriched elites while oppressing peasants and workers. His betrayal of the slogan "No re-election" was held up as proof of his hypocrisy. Strikes like Cananea and Rio Blanco, the dispossession of indigenous lands, and the massacre of dissenters were remembered as the darkest aspects of his regime. For the new revolutionary leaders, Madero, Zapata, Villa, Carranza, and later the post-revolutionary state, Díaz served as the negative example against which their legitimacy was built. To justify their struggle, they needed Díaz to be remembered as the tyrant toppled by the people's will. The revolution of 1910-1920 was not only a political and social upheaval, it was also a cultural revolution of memory. Textbooks, speeches, and monuments created a narrative in which Díaz was vilified and the revolution glorified. In official history, Díaz was portrayed as the final dictator of a corrupt order, swept away by the righteous tide of revolution. Zapata and Villa became celebrated as folk heroes of the oppressed, contrasted with Díaz's image as the oligarch's protector. The Porfiriato was cast as a period of slavery for peasants and sellout to foreign powers. This myth-making ensured that, for much of the 20th century, Díaz's name carried overwhelmingly negative connotations in Mexican political discourse. Yet even in revolutionary Mexico, Díaz's achievements could not be ignored. His contributions to modernization were visible everywhere: railroads, telegraphs, factories, schools, and the transformation of Mexico City into a modern capital. Foreign observers and even some Mexican elites continued to admire his ability to bring order to a country once plagued by instability. Over time, a more nuanced evaluation began to emerge. While the revolution condemned Díaz as a tyrant, intellectuals and historians also recognized that his policies had laid the foundations for Mexico's 20th century development. The contradiction was unavoidable. The revolution itself was, in part, a reaction to the modernization Díaz had set in motion. By the mid-20th century, historians began to reassess Díaz in more balanced terms. Scholars acknowledged both the progress and the repression of his rule. Economic modernization. Díaz integrated Mexico into the global economy, expanded infrastructure, and stabilized finances. Social costs. These achievements came at the expense of peasants, workers, and indigenous peoples, deepening inequalities. Political control. His democratic dictatorship was praised for stability, but condemned for silencing opposition. Some historians argued that Díaz's policies were necessary to modernize a country emerging from decades of instability. Others countered that his reliance on foreign capital and repression doomed Mexico to revolution. The debate over Díaz's legacy became in many ways a debate over modernization itself. Can true progress exist without democracy and social justice? Among ordinary Mexicans, memories of Díaz were more complex. In rural communities, particularly those dispossessed by haciendas, he was remembered as a tyrant whose policies destroyed livelihoods. Among elites and urbanites who prospered, he was sometimes nostalgically recalled as the leader who brought peace and order. Folk sayings reflected this ambivalence. Some remembered him as the man who kept Mexico in order with an iron fist. Others condemned him as el dictador, whose greed for power ruined the nation. This duality continues to this day. In popular culture, Díaz is sometimes portrayed as a stern but effective leader, other times as the embodiment of betrayal. In contemporary Mexico, Díaz's legacy remains politically charged. Different groups invoke his name for different purposes. Authoritarian nostalgia. Some argue that Díaz's strong leadership and order are models for contemporary governance, especially in times of crime and instability. His iron fist appeals to those who long for stability over democracy. Nationalist criticism. Others emphasize his subservience to foreign capital, portraying him as a cautionary tale of selling out Mexico's sovereignty. Balanced reassessment. A growing number of historians and citizens advocate a nuanced view, recognizing both the modernization he achieved and the injustices he perpetuated. The debate over whether Díaz should be honored, condemned, or simply remembered reflects broader tensions in Mexican society over how to balance progress, democracy, and sovereignty. Díaz's body remains in Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris, far from his homeland. Periodically, debates flare over whether his remains should be repatriated to Mexico. Supporters argue that, whatever his faults, Díaz was a major figure in Mexican history and deserves burial in his native land. Opponents counter that bringing him back would dishonor the revolution and glorify a dictator. So far, political sensitivities have prevented repatriation. His grave in Paris has become a quiet site of pilgrimage for some admirers and a symbol of exile for others. The very fact that this debate continues illustrates how unresolved his legacy remains. The legacy of Díaz offers enduring lessons for Mexico and beyond. 1. Modernization. Without justice is fragile. Díaz built railroads, factories, and cities, but ignored the plight of peasants and workers. Progress without equity bred revolution. 2. Authoritarian stability is temporary. His dictatorship created decades of order, but collapsed when its contradictions became unbearable. Stability imposed by force cannot last forever. 3. The role of memory in nation-building. How Díaz is remembered reflects Mexico's struggle to reconcile modernization, democracy, and national identity. History is not only about what happened, but also about how societies choose to interpret it. Porfirio Díaz's legacy is one of paradox. He was both a modernizer and a dictator, a patriot and an oppressor, a man who gave Mexico railroads and industries, but denied it democracy and justice. His rule transformed the country, for better and for worse, and the revolution that toppled him was both a rejection of his policies and a continuation of the modernization he initiated. In the end, Díaz's memory remains divided, just as Mexico itself was divided under his rule. To some, he was the father of modern Mexico. To others, its greatest betrayer. What cannot be denied is that he shaped the nation profoundly, leaving behind a legacy that continues to spark debate more than a century after his fall. Porfirio Díaz remains one of the most paradoxical figures in Latin American history. His life was a study in contradictions. He rose to power as a defender of democracy and no re-election, yet became synonymous with indefinite re-election and dictatorship. He embodied liberal ideals of modernization, yet ruled with repression and censorship. He modernized Mexico's economy and infrastructure, but deepened poverty for peasants and workers. He cultivated European sophistication while presiding over the dispossession of indigenous communities. These contradictions were not merely personal failings. They reflected the deeper tensions of a country caught between tradition and modernity, democracy and authoritarianism, sovereignty and dependence. There is no denying that Díaz transformed Mexico. Under his leadership, railroads expanded from a few hundred miles to nearly 20,000. Telegraphs crisscrossed the land, cities flourished, and the economy was integrated into global markets. The Porfiriato turned Mexico into a nation recognizable to the modern world. Yet these achievements came at a cost. Modernization was financed largely through foreign investment, leaving Mexico dependent on American and European capital. The wealth generated enriched elites, but bypassed the majority. Land concentration dispossessed peasants, labor exploitation embittered workers, and repression silenced dissent. The glittering facade of progress concealed deep inequalities. Díaz's model of modernization without justice created a fragile order, stable on the surface, brittle underneath. When rebellion erupted in 1910, the system collapsed with startling speed, proving that economic growth without political and social inclusion cannot endure. How did Díaz remain in power for more than 3 decades in a nation so turbulent? His success lay in a careful balancing act. He co-opted regional caudillos, courted foreign investors, appeased the church and built a network of loyal bureaucrats and generals. He mastered the art of repression, wielding the rurales and the army to crush dissent while maintaining the facade of constitutional government. His longevity also reflected a genuine desire among elites and foreign powers for stability. After decades of coups, invasions and chaos, Díaz offered order, even if at the price of liberty. Many accepted this bargain, at least until the costs became unbearable. But longevity also bred stagnation. By the early 20th century, Díaz was an aging leader presiding over a society transformed by forces he could no longer control. A rising middle class, a radicalized working class, dispossessed peasants, and growing nationalist resentment of foreign dominance. The very modernization he had fostered undermined his ability to maintain control. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 was in many ways the judgment on the Porfiriato. It was a rejection of his authoritarianism, a revolt against land dispossession, a protest against labor repression, and a demand for democracy. Yet it was also a continuation of his legacy. The revolution's leaders, Madero, Zapata, Villa, Carranza, built upon the economic and social transformations Díaz had unleashed. Without Díaz's modernization, the revolution might not have taken the shape it did. The railroads that carried rebel armies, the educated middle class that demanded democracy, the industrial workers who struck for their rights, all were products of the Porfiriato. Thus Díaz's downfall was not merely the end of an era, but the birth of modern Mexico. Now, a century later, Díaz's legacy remains contested. To some, he is the dictator who sold Mexico to foreigners and repressed his people. To others, he is the statesman who brought order and progress to a country in chaos. The truth lies in the uncomfortable middle. Díaz was both a modernizer and an oppressor, a patriot and a tyrant. His memory continues to divide Mexicans because it touches on enduring questions. Can progress justify authoritarianism? Is stability worth the sacrifice of democracy? What role should foreign investment play in national development? These questions remain relevant not only for Mexico, but for many nations grappling with the challenges of modernization and sovereignty. The story of Díaz offers timeless lessons. One, progress without inclusion is unsustainable. Modernization that enriches elites, while excluding the majority, breeds unrest and instability. 2. Authoritarian stability is temporary. Dictatorship can impose order for a time, but eventually the demand for liberty resurfaces, often explosively. Threat to history is never settled. How Díaz is remembered reflects more about present concerns than past events. His contested legacy shows how nations use history to define identity and values. Porfirio Díaz was more than a president. He was a symbol. To his supporters, he embodied discipline, modernization, and national pride. To his critics, he personified betrayal, repression, and foreign domination. In truth, he was a complex man shaped by Mexico's turbulent history. A soldier, a politician, a pragmatist, and a survivor. His death in Paris in 1915 symbolized both his distance from Mexico and his enduring hold on its memory. Though buried abroad, his presence remains in Mexico's railroads, cities, and debates. The Porfiriato cannot be erased, for it shaped the very Mexico that sought to move beyond it. Porfirio Díaz's life invites us to reflect on the paradox of progress through dictatorship. He gave Mexico railroads, cities, and industry, but denied it democracy and justice. He unified the nation, but at the price of silencing its people. His fall proved that no amount of modernization can compensate for exclusion and repression. More than a century later, Díaz's shadow still looms over Mexico. He is remembered with both condemnation and nostalgia, his legacy debated in classrooms, politics, and public squares. In the end, he remains what he was in life, a man who embodied Mexico's contradictions, its aspirations and its struggles. Porfirio Díaz was not simply the architect of progress or the dictator of repression, he was both. And in that paradox lies his enduring significance.